air fresheners in the car, finances, a possible security guard. Not only are we going to get into the substance of the morning session of this hearing, but our reporter got very close to David in court, and what she observed was interesting. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so we got day 2 of this preliminary hearing in the David case. Remember, he's facing first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, unlawful mutilation of human remains charges, all in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose decomposed, dismembered body was allegedly found in the front trunk of a Tesla, allegedly registered to him. This was back in September of 2025. This is a hearing where the court will determine if there's enough evidence for this to go forward to trial. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get into what happened right now in the morning session. Let me bring in our eyes, our ears, someone who's been in that courtroom for the past 2 days, including this morning session. So happy to have her, NBC LA reporter Julie Dang, who I must tell you, terrific notes. I'm looking at the live notes that you've been sending us, so detailed, so thorough. Again, excellent work. Before we even get into the substance of what has happened in this morning session, you have to tell us what you've been seeing in that courtroom, specifically David, right? Because I understand you got really, really close to him today, right? What did you see?
I did, Jesse. But first, I just want to tell you again, it is such a treat to be on this show with you because I love watching it. So yes, I was sitting right behind David this morning. I somehow got a seat in front of where they were seating other reporters. I think it's because I actually walked in a little bit later than everybody else did. So because of that, they had me seated on the end of one of the attorneys' rows in that courtroom, and I was right behind David. He didn't look too great. You know, his hair is grown out. He is unshaven. He's wearing that LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit, and he still has his feet and his waist shackled. He's not wearing handcuffs, though, so he was kind of splayed out in his chair, arms on his arm rests. I could see his yellow legal notepad that he had laid out in front of him, so I was trying to take a peek, trying to see if he was taking any notes. He didn't have anything written down. But there definitely were moments this morning during cross-examination of witnesses where he did lean in and talk to his attorneys. The first time I noticed that, it was during cross-examination related to financial management. They were essentially talking about how much money he made through his record deal and how that money was divvied up. Because so many people were involved in this operation. So many people were making money off of him, to put it bluntly. And that's a key part of this case, because murder for financial gain is one of the special circumstances here that makes this eligible for the death penalty. But the district attorney, Nathan Hochman, did say yesterday they haven't actually decided yet if that's something they're going to pursue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the idea is, and I'm going to get to the witnesses who testified today, if they can show how lucrative his career was, at $11.5 million, that if Celeste came out and exposed him for this alleged illegal sexual relationship, she was going to take it all away. So the more they can amplify that, I get where they're going. I get what they're trying to do. Before, we get into the substance, I also understand that Celeste's family was back in that courtroom. We talked about yesterday how incredibly difficult it was for them to have to sit through the photos of Celeste's body, dismembered, found in that Tesla. What was it like to see them in court today?
It's really tough. You know, Jesse, I told you yesterday, I cannot begin to imagine what they are going through. Yesterday, I was sitting directly behind them, 3 rows behind. Today, I'm sitting at an angle in the row right behind where they're seated, so I can see both of their facial expressions, the mother and father of Celeste. And I actually just ran into her mother, Mercedes, again upstairs in the restroom. It's really tough. Where we just wrapped before this lunch break, we were hearing testimony from an LAPD criminologist. This was one of the officers called to investigate after the Tesla was towed to one of their tech centers. So we were looking at photos the prosecutor was showing the court of 11 different air fresheners that were found in that Tesla. I mean, Celeste's remains had been in there decomposing, likely for months. So to cover up that smell, somebody put nearly a dozen air fresheners, not just inside the car, but actually in the front trunk.
Yeah.
And that's where the cadaver bags with her remains were found. So it's not just that this crime was committed, it's that somebody went to truly horrifying lengths, Jesse, to try and cover up their tracks. I could see her parents kind of shrinking into themselves and moving a little bit closer together when those photos came up. There's so many elements of this that are horrifying in ways I don't think we can fully imagine for them. So I'm curious to see what their attorney, what their wrongful death attorney, who's not actually involved in this criminal case, what he has to say to us later today. We chatted briefly upstairs. It sounds like he is going to take more questions from us later today.
Let me ask you now about the testimony. So they continue the testimony of Benjamin Greger. I don't know if I'm saying the name correctly, this Mogul Vision finance director, this business associate of David, talking about David's finances. Talk to me about what the start of today's testimony was like. And by the way, I was reading, is he an interesting witness? Is he a bit combative in a way? Is his testimony not consistent with what he told the grand jury? So what exactly is the tone of his testimony, and what did he say today?
Jesse, that's a really gentle way of putting it, inconsistent. Yeah, I noted that yesterday. I sent you guys a couple notes about that as it was happening. Yes, he does come across as a little bit combative when he's talking to prosecutors, when he's talking to the deputy DA here, Beth Silverman. When she was cross-examining him, there were several instances where he gave her answers that not just misaligned, but were in direct opposition to what he apparently said during grand jury hearings. And she was actually referencing transcripts from those secret grand jury hearings to verify that, to be like, wait a minute, did you mean this house or the other house was going to be put up as collateral so David could make bail? And then she asked him very pointedly several times, is your testimony accurate today or was it accurate then? So I think any instance where a witness is apparently changing their story on the stand, it makes you wonder, who had they been talking to? You know, was some kind of deal perhaps discussed or even struck? Why did their story change? And then obviously, what's in it for them?
Cameras and audio recording are not allowed at this multiple-day preliminary hearing in Los Angeles. Prosecutors are trying to prove they have enough evidence for this case to move forward to trial. Now, we are one of the few media outlets with someone in the courtroom, and NBC LA reporter Julia Dang will join me here in just a moment. Now, I want you to take a look at some new courtroom sketches we just got in from day 2 of this preliminary hearing per artist Mona Edwards. One of the big points of contention today was how the Tesla, where Celeste's body was found in July of last year, was processed by police. David's high-powered defense attorneys are really taking aim at how evidence was handled, and to this point, it is fair to question how prosecutors will prove that David was the one who committed such a terrible crime and not someone else. Joining us now to talk more about what happened in court today, Julia Dang, reporter with NBC LA. Great to have you here on Law and Crime. A lot to get to today. I just want to first start, though, with David himself. Yesterday, we talked a lot about his demeanor, at times maybe seeming bored as this was going on. What stood out to you today about how he seemed to be acting?
Hey there, Chris. Great to be with you. It was really the same with David. He was let in first thing this morning when day 2 of this preliminary hearing started He was shackled at first. They did take off his handcuffs. That was part of the agreement yesterday after his attorneys made that request for him to be unshackled in the courtroom. He is just sitting there, very still, not taking very many notes, not saying much to his team. There were portions of testimony today where I noted David just staring straight ahead. There really isn't much on his face that we can read, but I did have an interesting sidebar conversation with a courtroom sketch artist. Now, as an artist, obviously she has this very valuable perspective because she's being paid to draw this guy. She's also sitting in a different location in that courtroom, right? She's sitting in the jury box, so she's looking right at the defendant, David Burke. So we chatted for a little bit during the court break, during lunch, and she said it looks to her like he couldn't care less about what happens. There's kind of a glib manner to how he's moving and how he's interacting with his team and how he's kind of just staring straight ahead. So I asked her, is this typical? You've been through hundreds of criminal trials. You've sketched probably more criminal defendants than you could count. Have you seen this before? And she kind of nodded and said, yeah, I've seen this. So other people I've talked to, words they've used about David's demeanor in that courtroom, they've described it as off, as sociopathic. We've only heard him speak a couple times, just, yes, Your Honor, or I understand. And he's dressed in the exact same way he was yesterday. He's wearing that orange LA County jail uniform, that jumpsuit. He's got grown out hair. He's wearing black glasses, and he looks unshaven and, frankly, pretty exhausted.
When you think about, this is someone who was set to make millions. He was already making millions of dollars, but with this new album that was coming out, he was set to make a lot of money. And you think about that, really, if he's convicted of this, that is all gone. And yet he just has this demeanor about him that I think is surprising to a lot of people. You would also think his attorneys have probably prepared him to how to act, how he should act as this preliminary hearing goes on. As far as today, Julia, inside the courtroom, there was a lot of evidence talking about what could be presumed as blood. Inside the Tesla, in the garage, there's this blue star technology. And if you've seen pictures of it in other cases, you have kind of this blue splatter on the wall after they put a chemical down. And they say that that is presumably where blood once was. Of course, when you think of Celeste, her remains were allegedly found in the front trunk of this Tesla. But that's not the only place where law enforcement is now alleging where they found blood in the car. What stood out to you about that part of the testimony today?
That's right. That was the key part of the testimony today from the prosecution's witnesses. So we did start wrapping up testimony from yesterday relating to financial management and just how much money David was making. And then we heard from a CHP officer who testified about where Celeste's passport ID was found months after her body was found. That was up in Santa Barbara County. And then we heard from two LAPD staffers. They are criminalists. One was the primary criminalist who processed the scene with the Tesla, and the other was involved in the search of David's house up in the Hollywood Hills a couple days after the body was found on September 17th of last year. So this is what was new and what was really interesting, Chris. We haven't heard about this detail before. According to this testimony from one of those two LAPD criminalists, there was actually blood identified in the brick flooring underneath where a car would have been parked. And that was underneath black rubber mats that were laid down on the garage floor in David's house. So what they seem to be painting a picture of here is blood leaking out of David's Tesla, seeping through those rubber floor mats and then seeping down into that brick flooring. hearing that, and sitting right behind the victim's parents, it was jarring. There is so much evidence in this case that has been unsettling in truly shocking ways that I don't think I've experienced before anywhere. But being, in that courtroom with the victim's parents, I think that drives home the point that this is about a human, this is about a teenager, this is about a girl who was killed and dismembered. This is about justice for her.
It really is. And I keep thinking since yesterday about just that moment that I know you witnessed in person of these images that were put up on the screen of Celeste remains and what they found. And not just as jarring as it must have been for you, the members of the media, the members of the public who were in the courtroom, but like here are her parents who were private people before all of this. And I know her civil attorney has talked about that. These were not, people who were in the limelight prior to all of this happening. And then suddenly you're in the center of this case about your daughter, and then you're looking at these images up on the screen. And some of the evidence that's been brought out too, kind of going back to that Tesla, was today about air fresheners. And there were 11 air fresheners that were found, which that's a lot of air fresheners to have in your car, to be blunt.
Yeah.
How did that tie into what prosecutors seem to be laying out about how that vehicle was used in what they're accusing David of doing?
I'm glad you bring that up, because that was what really stood out to me, Chris, during testimony from the first LAPD criminalist we heard from today. There were at least 11 air fresheners found in that Tesla by the time this criminalist was called out to the Piper technical scene where the car was towed to from the Hollywood tow yard. At least 11. And here's the detail that caught my attention about where in the car those air fresheners were found. They were not just in the interior, they found them in the center console, they found them in the back seats. They also found air fresheners in the front trunk. So this isn't just about how Celeste was killed, how her body was then mutilated. This is also about the cover-up efforts. I mean, somebody must have noticed, oh, it smells terrible. We got to do something to cover that up. So somebody actually opened up the front trunk.
Is the court going to determine that there is sufficient evidence to support these charges for this case to move forward against David? Like I said, a lot to get into. Let's jump in. Okay, so let me bring in once again our eyes and our ears in that courtroom, Julia Deng, NBC LA reporter who has been fantastic. We get her notes in every day. They are so thorough, they are so specific, they're so detailed. Thank you so much for coming on. So first of all, before we even get into the substance, before we even talk about the demeanor of David, this court day started with fireworks. The judge was not happy. What happened?
Jesse, what a morning. We are in day 3 now of this preliminary hearing, and it started with a little bit of drama this morning. There was actually a reporter who was kicked out of the courtroom. The judge excluded her from today's proceedings because apparently there were live transmission rules that were violated. So this court has been very strict about preserving the integrity of this case. And we've talked about this before. Obviously, no cameras are allowed in that courtroom, no phones. I'm not communicating with you guys, with really anybody in the outside world, as all of this is going down. And it's part of this larger, I think, respect of the integrity of this court. And the spirit of this court, because they want to ensure everything is done properly. Nobody here wants to risk any kind of mistrial, anything leaking that is not supposed to. So right now, during this court break, we can talk to you about what exactly went down.
And look, it's understandable. I mean, particularly when you're dealing with such a high-profile case like this and the sensitive nature of this case. You're talking about the alleged sexual abuse, murder and dismemberment of a minor, of a 14-year-old girl. So let me ask you this too. A guy that we've had on the show multiple times, Steve Fisher, the private investigator who was apparently hired by the owner of the property where David had been staying, right? This is near where the Tesla was reportedly found. So he's been investigating from day one. We've had him on the show. Some drama with him in the courtroom today, right? What happened there?
Right.
That's right. Now, according to the prosecutor in this case, the deputy DA, Beth Silverman, apparently Steve Fisher violated grand jury secrecy. And because of that, she made a request this morning for him to be excluded from the witness list. He was in the courtroom. He was sitting right by me. He stood up, acknowledged that request. There wasn't any kind of pushback. There was no argument there. And he walked out. So we're not going to hear from Steve Fisher in the courtroom as part of this preliminary hearing. But obviously, if this goes to trial, we do expect to hear from him. I know he's been on your show. I've heard those interviews. He has a lot of intel that I think is going to be critical to this case if it goes to trial. But right now, we are still in prelim. This is day 3. They just need to establish probable cause for this to move forward. So we are now on, I think, witness number 8 as this continues, and we're all expecting this to go through the rest of today and likely even tomorrow, maybe on Monday as well.
Yeah, and look, Steve Fisher has provided, really, really insightful information in this case, some of which has actually been backed up by what we saw by the prosecution's filing. It was not surprising considering what we heard from Steve, and he's been quite vocal about this case. He's been quite vocal about David. He's been quite vocal about the prosecution as well, so interesting development. Okay, before we get to the witnesses, I always have to ask you, since we don't see it ourselves, it's the best we get are sketches from the courtroom artist. David, what's his demeanor like in court? Because the way we've been looking at it the past few days, for somebody who is, by all accounts, I mean, if you ask me my legal opinion, I think there's going to be enough here for this case to move to trial. For somebody whose life is on the line, for somebody who's facing murder and continuous sexual abuse of a minor charges and unlawful mutilation of human remains charges, the past few days, what we've seen, how it's been described, is somebody who seems kind of like nonchalant, pretty bored, kind of casual, doesn't seem to be too stressed out. Is that what he's looking like today?
Yeah, Jesse, and I can't get past that. I mean, imagine if you or somebody you knew were in that hot seat. I mean, I think you might care a little bit more. Let me tell you, actually, what the courtroom sketch artist said. I chatted with Mona Schaefer-Edwards during the court break about an hour ago, and I said to her, you know what, Mona, you've got the most interesting perspective in this courtroom in the sense that she's sitting facing the defendant. She's in the jury box area, so she gets to see his face, his expressions, and she's been sketching this for all of us who are using her art to cover this case. So she told me, Jesse, it looks to her like David is, quote, on another plane. He seems completely disengaged. I'm reading his facial expressions kind of from off to the side. I'm watching him from an angle. He's not reacting much. You know, it's a lot the same as yesterday, where he's kind of just staring straight ahead at the witness who's testifying and then that overhead monitor that's projecting the exhibits. But no, he's really not reacting, and that includes when we see the victim's clothing, you know, her soiled, blood-stained, insect-infested, wet clothing that was found in the cadaver bags along with her remains. He's just staring straight ahead. He's got his arms folded. He's got this yellow legal notepad in front of him. It doesn't look to me like he's taking any notes. He's got a white styrofoam cup of water. I've counted maybe 2 or 3 interactions today where he's turned a little bit and kind of had, you know, a brief exchange of words with one of his attorneys. But other than that, he's not even moving, Jesse. It's really incredible.
But I'm not here to speculate, but I just have to ask, do you know if he's on any kind of medication or anything like that?
I don't know, Jesse, and we're not going to speculate on this show, but that is a question that's come up in sidebar conversations. We don't know, and that hasn't come up in court.
Okay.
I imagine if he is, it will.
Okay, got it. All right, let's talk about the substance. So the first witness back on the stand was this criminalist, right? And being questioned by the defense. What happened there?
So we ended yesterday with the cross-examination of an LAPD criminalist. She was the one who was called to process evidence found in David's garage. And that evidence included everything from trash bags to rubber floor mats to bloodstains. She was the one who tested chainsaws found in David's house. This was just about a week after the car was found in the Hollywood tow yard with the victim's remains in the front trunk, of course. So they continued with that cross-examination, and there was a lot of back and forth about the chainsaws. And here's why. Defense attorney Blair Burke noted there was no positive test indicating the possibility of blood on those chainsaws. So she kept on asking this LAPD witness for the prosecution why they didn't take those chainsaws into evidence. It sounded like she wanted to make the point that touch DNA, which they didn't test for, may have indicated something else, may have painted a more comprehensive picture of what exactly happened and who may have been involved, who else may have been involved, that is. But the criminalist was very sharp, very clear with her answers. At one point yesterday, she even brought her notes back out to make sure that she gave precisely the information that was documented during this investigation. So she said there did not appear to be any kind of forensic value to those chainsaws that were found in the garage, and that's why they were not taken into evidence. So my big takeaway from all of this is that perhaps those were not the weapons or tools used for dismemberment, even though they were found in David's garage during this search.
Let me just clarify this point, just so it's clear for our audience. I heard there was reporting, maybe even testimony, about a missing chainsaw. I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah.
And what about any evidence of a cleanup, including of the chainsaws? Correct me if I'm wrong about either of those points.
Correct on the first point. There was another chainsaw, a Makita brand chainsaw that we talked about the other day that was ordered online and delivered to David's house. As far as I know, from the evidence presented so far, that chainsaw was not located during this search. The two other chainsaws, and here's why the criminalist said there really was no forensic value. She testified earlier that had they been used for dismemberment, there would have been no way for blood to be cleaned up to the point where their testing did not indicate something of forensic value. So when they did that initial test on scene and there was no presumptive positive, they elected not to take those two chainsaws into evidence. But yes, there is a missing one. There is another one, and I'm sure that's going to come up later in this testimony.
Look, as shocking as a case like this is, it is not a shock that there would be blood or presumed traces of blood at a crime scene. But what about fake blood? That is not something we were expecting, but it is one of the pieces of information we learned about today in David's preliminary hearing. Investigators say they found jugs of fake blood in the singer's garage. We'll talk a little bit about why the singer may have had that blood in his garage and how it could factor into this case as we move forward in just a moment with our reporter who is in the courtroom today. I want you to also take a look at some of the new sketches that we have in from artist Mona Edwards. David, today, once again, we're told looked emotionless. As prosecutors continue to lay out evidence they say proves that he killed Celeste as they try to move this case to the next step in the legal process. Joining us now, just stepping out of the courtroom, is Julia Dang, NBC LA reporter. Thanks for being here once again. I want to start with how things wrapped up at the end of today. And we heard from a deputy medical examiner. This is the person who did the autopsy on Celeste Rivas Hernandez. What stood out to you about what he had to say?
That's right, Chris. We just broke for the day. We actually didn't think we were going to get to this witness today, but Dr. Grantho took the stand just about 4 minutes before we wrapped for today, day 3 of this preliminary hearing in the murder case against 21-year-old David Anthony Burke. So he just started laying out his findings from this autopsy conducted September 10th. That was 2 days after this teenager's remains were found in the front trunk of David's Tesla. He's testifying about the state of decomposition It was tough, incredibly tough to see the photos the other day in court. Hearing this testimony now from the deputy medical examiner who actually led the autopsy, this might be even tougher, Chris, in different ways. So I completely understood when the victim's parents actually got up and left the courtroom before he took the stand. They are not sitting in there for this testimony. But he's talking about the state of decomposition. He testified that when they weighed her remains, it only came out to 71 pounds. The last thing he said on the stand before we ended today was that she still had her braces on. And of course, it was the dental records that helped them make that positive identification, because when they found her remains, there was so much decomposition, there was so much skin slippage, they couldn't identify her. There simply was not enough left.
And I saw in your notes, just kind of going through it, and just that line that she still had her braces on. And, we'll talk more about her family and everything they've been going through these last couple of days. But that just is a reminder that we're talking about not just a person who lost their life, but, such a young person at 14 years old, at the center of this case. And this week trying to see what happens next. And as far as whether it continues down, the track to potentially going to trial one day, seemed like there was a lot of DNA evidence today, and very much in the weeds about what was found, what tested positive. For you, what was the headline and kind of the moment when you think back through hours of testimony today, especially when it came to DNA, that really stood out to you?
My main takeaway, Chris, is that a good defense attorney, a strong defense team, can question anything and everything. And that is going to be key if this does indeed go to trial, which I think most people in that courtroom do expect. The threshold here in this preliminary hearing phase is much lower. The prosecution only needs to show probable cause. Think of that as kind of like a 51% threshold. But if this does go to trial, in order for a jury to convict, that's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Think of that as more like a 99.9% probability. So this is kind of like rehearsal for both sides. They're testing out their witnesses. They're seeing how they perform on this stand as humans being questioned, in front of a live audience under a lot of pressure. And we in the media, we're getting a sense of what questions might be asked during trial, how these witnesses are going to hold up, and how they might look and sound and feel to a live jury of their peers. Now, to your question about this DNA evidence, we spent the bulk of the afternoon going through that testimony. It started with questions from Deputy DA Beth Silverman. It was her witness. Samantha Tosh, an LAPD criminalist, who's from the LAPD crime lab, who is responsible for testing, analyzing, and reporting on DNA samples. And then defense attorneys did their cross-examination, and then that witness went back to the prosecution, and then defense had more questions for her. So what all of that adds up to is a lot of information that can be looked at different ways, right? None of this is actually definitive. And the witness, the LAPD criminalist, was careful to make that clear. She's using language like possible or probable, but the statistics that she laid out, and we're talking about figures, right, with 24 zeros after the first digit. She laid out statistics that make it unlikely, if not close to impossible, for these DNA matches to be from anybody but Celeste. Now the question is, where is that DNA match actually coming from? Is it definitively coming from blood, or could it be something like skin? Because she spent time living in that house and touching items in the garage. That's what defense attorneys spent quite a bit of time today questioning, going back and forth with that one witness, if this does go to trial, I think we can expect a lot more of that, Chris.
And there's so many pieces of evidence, I feel like, Julia, as like this has gone on for the last couple of days, where from a circumstantial standpoint, it seems incredibly strong for the prosecution, but then you'll have David's defense attorneys come back and just nitpick every single word of what a witness said. As far as some of where DNA was found, there were blood stains in the Tesla, and through just kind of going through some of these notes, that there was a toenail that was Celeste, and then they were able to create a DNA profile on that. But then you get into these trash bags, I believe, that were found at David's house, right? And then there are these wipes in the trash bag, and like it does not get. To me, it came off just kind of going through this like it's muddied and it's not clear who is handling what inside the house. And there's even some DNA on there that may be from other people. We don't know. Like, what did you make of kind of all of those different layers to what seems like a really complicated part of the story that the prosecution's trying to tell?
When I first heard some of that DNA evidence from the LAPD witness when the prosecution was questioning her, I felt like it was incredibly compelling evidence. I mean, you can't question something with a statistical probability that's got 24 zeros behind the first digit, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess if you are Blair Burke, you can question that. And she raised a couple hypotheticals about that compelling DNA evidence. She actually laid out a scenario about tertiary transfer, right? She told the court, what if I shook my co-counsel's hand and then I touched the podium and then the judge put her notebook down on the podium, right? Could my co-counsel's DNA then end up being transferred to that notebook? And the witness answered that on the stand. Yes, that's a possibility. So gaps like that being created by the defense in just about everything the prosecution is laying out, that I think is going to be a recurring theme for the rest of this preliminary hearing, and certainly if it goes to trial. And any member of the jury listening to this, it's going to come down to what they believe, who they believe, and how much doubt the defense can cast on all of this.
So now we are going back, and today's big because this is the testimony of the deputy medical examiner, Dr. Grant Ho. Let's talk about it. Okay, let me bring in our eyes and our ears once again. Julia Deng, NBC LA reporter who has been fantastic throughout all of this. Good to see you again. There's a lot to get into here. There is a lot to get into when we talk about the deputy medical examiner's testimony. But before we even do that, we've always started by talking about David's demeanor in the courtroom. And the way that we've gone through it for the past several days, it's that he looks kind of bored. He looks like you described, the court reporter even said yesterday that he looks like he's on another plane, disengaged. Today, though, if I'm reading the notes that you sent over, a little bit different from David today, right?
A tiny bit, Jesse. He is a little bit more animated. He came in today, wearing the standard LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit. He's got a shirt on underneath it. Hair is kind of grown out. He looks tired, unshaven, but he did seem a little bit more animated. He sat down, had a conversation with one of his defense attorneys, and then started smiling and chit-chatting a little bit with her. That was different. But once testimony started up again, and we were hearing from the deputy medical examiner, one of two people involved in actually performing the autopsy on Celeste after her remains were found in David's Tesla, he went back to his usual, expressionless, emotionless, really motionless pose sitting at the counsel table. He's staring straight ahead, kind of just blinking at the witness on the stand, staring at the exhibits on that overhead monitor, and really not moving, not reacting.
And by the way, before we even get into the substance of the testimony, where I really think it's interesting what both this medical examiner had to say and what the defense has been saying, the photos that were shown to the whole gallery, which you saw, your reporting indicates there was an audible reaction in the courtroom to those photos. Can you describe what you mean by that?
There was an audible reaction. There was a visceral reaction. And let me describe to you what happened, possibly by accident. Before we were actually shown the exhibits that we were supposed to see in the order that they were supposed to be presented, during this deputy medical examiner's testimony, the projector in the courtroom actually flipped through numerous autopsy photos before we were supposed to see that. So imagine, right, this overhead monitor, kind of like flipbook style, in a matter of seconds, going through probably about half a dozen photos. And I'm talking autopsy photos, showing the victim's torso, open chest cavity, extremities, laid out, cleaned off and laid out on a silver exam table. There was an audible gasp. A reporter sitting behind me in the courtroom, you could hear her reacting to this. You could see everybody reacting, I think, very viscerally. But Dr. Grant Ho, the witness on the stand right now, he's going through this methodically, step by step. For him, this is his day-to-day. This is just part of his job, and he's answering the questions that way. There's nothing emotional, nothing grisly or gruesome about any of this to him.
Makes you think about that job. I mean, my gosh. Okay, so today's an important day. There has been so much about evidence about David's alleged illegal relationship with Celeste. There's been a lot of evidence and testimony regarding the potential cleanup, the dismemberment. When it comes to the actual killing, when it comes to the actual alleged murder, this is what we were waiting for. What did Dr. Grant Ho say about the cause and manner of death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez?
There is a lot of back and forth during this cross-examination now of Dr. Grant Ho, but he repeated findings from the medical examiner's office that have already been published. This was released months ago. We have reported on this, but he walked us through, with the support of visuals this time that we have not previously seen from the autopsy. He walked us through what they already found months ago. They decided the cause and manner of death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was homicide, and they attributed her death to multiple penetrating injuries. Here's what's interesting, though. They did not identify what kind of weapon or tool caused those penetrating injuries. And they stopped short of actually calling it a penetrating injury caused by a sharp instrument. So they're not saying that she was definitely stabbed to death. And that's because of the advanced state of decomposition. They simply don't know for sure exactly how or what caused a lot of what they found, which we are looking at right now in the courtroom, documented in these very, very visual exhibits.
Let me tell you why that's so significant. You know, but our audience should know. One of the special circumstance allegations in this case that has been presented by prosecutors is that David Anthony Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, a sharp instrument, to commit this crime. And yet what you're telling us is this deputy medical examiner can't definitively say that that's the case.
We don't know that for sure. And I think defense attorneys made a point of underscoring that several times. That is one of the elements of this first-degree felony murder charge that is interesting, that is different, right? And if he is convicted, there could be a sharp instrument enhancement. I believe in the state of California that could tack on an additional consecutive year. But those 3 additional special circumstances, that makes this murder case eligible for the death penalty. Here's what else the deputy medical examiner doesn't know for sure. And defense leaned really hard into all of this on cross. They don't know which penetrating injury occurred first. There's one on the victim's abdomen, and there's one on her lateral left chest. So one is associated possibly with liver damage. The other possibly with rib damage and diaphragm damage. Deputy Emmy can't say which one happened first. He can't say definitively whether or not they may have happened seconds apart. He cannot say which one caused her death. He cannot say how long it may have taken Celeste to die from either one of those injuries. There's so much we simply don't know. And that created a gap for one of the defense attorneys to ask something that we have not heard yet in this case. She asked this witness, this deputy medical examiner, if he could rule out that Celeste may have inflicted both of these stab wounds on her own. And he said, based on his findings in this autopsy, that was not something that he could definitively rule out. The reaction in the courtroom following that line of questioning, though, I turned around and I could see a couple people, glancing at each other, eyebrows raised. It looked and felt to me like people watching this line of questioning felt like it may have been bordering on the absurd. It may not be something a jury would believe.
Let's map that out for a second. So in other words, and this is based on what we saw this week from the defense, they are potentially building the argument, if this goes to trial, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Celeste would have come over to his place, something happened, she killed herself or had an overdose, David panicked and tried to get rid of her body. I mean, is that something that you see the building blocks for, even though they've tried to, because remember, one of the most significant things I think the defense has been trying to do is saying, well, all these alleged purchases, the chainsaws, the laundry bags, the body bag, was all after she allegedly died. So it's not like he planned to kill her. Am I understanding that that's maybe the building blocks of where they may go as a potential defense?
Jesse, I don't know if that's where the defense is actively trying to go. I think this is their opportunity during this preliminary hearing to kind of test out different lines of questioning, right? See what sticks. See where the biggest openings might be for them to just create more gaps in the prosecution's case. I don't believe that line of questioning is going to go anywhere. But here's how they laid it out this morning. Marilyn Bednarski was the one asking Dr. Grant Ho these questions. She wanted to know first, is it helpful for somebody doing an autopsy to maybe have information about whether the decedent has a mental health history? Is it helpful to know if they are suicidal? Is it helpful to know if they are habitual drug users? So to each of those questions, Dr. Ho answered, potentially. So then she asked him, did you have any conversations with the decedent's relatives to explore those characteristics? He did not. So then she proceeded to ask about the injuries, right? The documented injuries, these penetrating wounds, the disruption to one of her ribs, the damage noted on her liver. And the defense wants to know, can you definitively link those observations that were made during the autopsy to what you see on the overlying skin? And do you know exactly how that occurred? Are you able to definitively report that somebody else caused those injuries? And I think the broad answer to all of this is the advanced state of decomposition precludes a lot of definitive information. The deputy ME simply cannot say how this happened or who did this to her. I don't know if this is actually going to end up being a building block for an argument that Celeste killed herself, but it's certainly a line of questioning that I think any sharp defense attorney would explore during this opportunity, during this preliminary hearing that we've been calling kind of a mini bench trial or a rehearsal for trial, if you will.
And I mean, if they're trying to muddy the waters in terms of how long had she been dead for, and they might be suggesting can you definitively say she died on that night in April? What about this whole back and forth about a gunshot wound?
This was interesting too, because this was new. And Dr. Ho just clarified on the stand before we broke for lunch that his way of saying anything could have happened to inflict what he'd observed on her ribs, damage to one of her left ribs, that could have come from anything. He cannot say with certainty that it came from a knife or another sharp instrument. And the reason, again, that they attributed her death to penetrating wounds as opposed to a sharp instrument is because they cannot rule out a possible gunshot wound with an exit wound in her body. They don't know for sure what killed Celeste.
And there was also discussion about the chainsaws, right? So, in other words, yesterday and the past few days, we know that chainsaws were collected. But as far as we know, they tested negative for blood. There seems to be one chainsaw that may be missing. In terms of a chainsaw potentially being used to inflict these injuries on Celeste, whether it was in the form of, her cause of death, remember, to kill her or to dismember her, what was the discussion of chainsaws today?
So the witness was very careful to answer that line of questioning. He noted, I think, several times that he is not an expert when it comes to tools, power tools used to dismember bodies. He did offer up some general knowledge about what might lead to the types of cuts that he noted on the victim's body. He described it as clean or smooth around the edges. That, though, I think is going to be called into question as well, because the appearance of all of these wounds, right, they have changed post-mortem during decomposition. But he talked about how to cut through soft tissue or organs, you can do that with a scalpel. He talked about how to cut through bone, you might use something like a bone saw. And he said to cut through rib, you would need something essentially like hedge cutters. That's what he said on the stand. Still, he cannot definitively identify what was used to sever this victim's limbs from her body.
And to be clear, the prosecution hasn't laid out a specific murder weapon or what happened to a potential murder weapon?
They have not yet. We do know 2 of the chainsaws found in David's garage during a search about a week after the Tesla was found with the victim's remains in the front trunk. We do know those 2 chainsaws tested negative for blood.
What about the insect activity?
That was another detail that I think got a visible reaction in the courtroom this morning. Dr. Ho described the beginning stages of maggots all around the victim's remains when he first got the case, when he was preparing to do the autopsy. I think it was a good morning for the victim's parents, both of her parents, who've been sitting in for most of this preliminary hearing to not be in the courtroom. I walked past them in the hallway just now when I was exiting for lunch. They are here. They are in the courthouse, but they elected not to sit in there this morning for this testimony. I think that was an understandable move on their part.